Hello and welcome to episode 88 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have some ROsterMania news to talk about, some long-awaited OpTic Texas roster changes. We even had the aforementioned Atlanta FaZe roster change that we talked about last week. Some stuff with the Boston Breach and a report about the Minnesota RØKKR that we will get to throughout this show. But before we get to any of it, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Trade deadline today in MLB wasn't as exciting for the Yankees as they had hoped, but we move on. We got some more exciting COD news to talk about.
I wish we had a trade deadline in the CDL, or just trades in general would be nice. I think they would make it a little more interesting with roster changes. I'm not sure how many of there actually have been since the CDL started. I think the biggest pre-CDL one would have been like Clayster and Gunless in IW. It was, I think, with FaZe and E United. That deal ended up being very, very good for E United, not as good for FaZe, but I think it turned out well for FaZe as a whole. So let's get into this ROsterMania stuff, because we teased the Atlanta FaZe one, but we'll get to that later because we did discuss a lot of it, and everybody knew what was going to happen. I think it was the day that we published, the day after we recorded, Atlanta FaZe announced their roster change. But the one that we've been waiting for, and that has been really the center of discussion all off season, it comes down to OpTic Texas. Drazah had been linked to OpTic Texas in the offseason. It seemed at one point it was going to be Drazah and Pred to join Dashy and Shotzi in the OpTic Texas lineup. It turns out, and we had known this for a few weeks, that Kenny and Pred were going to be the players to replace Hook and Ghosty in the lineup. So the lineup now for OpTic heading into the next CDL season, or whatever kind of season we will have at the end of the year, will be Pred, Kenny, Dashy, and Shotzi. A pretty formidable lineup with some of the most talented players in the entire world, all on one roster, as you would expect of an OpTic roster. What is Bink's reaction? What is your reaction to OpTic, their new lineup, and how you see them fitting together?
Yeah, I like the squad on paper. I think it's a little, when there were the reports of Drazah and Pred, and then Sib and Pred, and then Kenny and Pred. I think of those three on paper, the one I liked the most was Sib and Pred. And I don't think that's a knock on Drazah or Kenny. I just think in terms of like bringing in a very young duo who has 2 years of experience playing together, from a chemistry perspective, I kind of just liked that idea. But the more I haven't listened to like all of the OpTic content that's come out over the last couple of days with them talking to Scump and Zenny and all that stuff. But the general vibe, and it could just be the green wall being the green wall, but the general vibe is a lot of excitement. I feel like a lot of people seem to think the squad has just immediate championship contender status, and I tend to agree with that. It's always weird to talk about this stuff when we don't even know what the next game is gonna be like. But one thing we have talked about, and especially with guys like Kenny and Drazah in the past, is the flexibility of the flex role and those players in particular. We've talked at length now over several episodes about both of those guys and how they were able to run a sub and an AR. And in the case of LAT, when they won the World Championship, it was moving Kenny from an AR to a sub, and Drazah from a sub to an AR. That seemingly like unlocked LAT's final form ahead of the back-to-back in the World Championship. So the signing of Kenny, although it seems to be, seemingly a lot of discussion around that, is kind of how he could be a veteran presence for the team, which is kind of weird to think about to me. I know he was playing in 2018 in World War II, but that really doesn't seem that long ago. But then you think about how many actual old school veterans have left, and Kenny has been around for a while in comparison to some of these other guys. But nonetheless, I think Kenny, as a guy who has done it with both an AR and an SMG at a high level, will be invaluable to this team in terms of, them not really having to worry about what the next game meta is necessarily. They have two really strong SMG guys in Pred and Sib. If it's a 3-sub meta, Kenny just slides right in. And if it's, a 2 AR meta, they don't have that issue at all. So it will be interesting to see exactly, how the squad gels together and all that stuff. But I think at least on paper right now, just after them signing and officially confirming it, they got to be in the upper echelon of teams and, probably a top 3, top 4 contender just right off the bat without obviously knowing what the next game is like.
Yeah, they're always going to be on the list of the teams that are expected to win a world championship. They're going to be with FaZe, now New York, depending on Toronto. I would imagine if they finalize that 4-man roster, I think those are probably the top 4 teams heading into the new season, especially with LIT seemingly heading toward a rebuild of some kind. So like I said, OpTic is probably in that top 4 based on the talent that is present on that roster. But we've always talked about that with OpTic, and that's always been one of the things that at least I've always been disappointed with OpTic in, is that they have always had talent. Dating back to when I got into competitive COD in 2013, the roster was Merc, Big Timer, Scump, and Nadeshot. And Big Timer at the time was like the winningest COD player at that point. He had won COD XP, obviously, that's not a competitive event, but he had also had a ton of success with Extravagant and Apex and OpTic at that point. Merc was also a really talented player. Scump was the best player in the world, or one of the top 3 best players in the world. And Nadeshot, not to diminish him, but he was a good objective player, and he was the celebrity of the 4, and he was by far the most popular player in the entire scene. So they've had talent from that moment on, at least, and I've been watching COD for 10 years, and they've even got more talented and become more of a competitive focused team rather than a content team as they were in 2013 to 2015, really. And once Nadeshot left, they became a dynasty with Crim6 and Formal and Karma, with Scump. And they've always been good in the CDL era, but it doesn't seem to translate to consistent championships for them. In the CDL's history, they won the first event, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe they just won the kickoff. Maybe I'm just thinking.
No, the very first, they just did those show matches.
Yeah.
And that's where it was like OpTic versus Dallas, and Formal and Scump were screaming across the stage at Crim because it was right after Crim left or got dropped, whatever. But then I believe the first event would have been London, and I think they beat Dallas there.
Yeah. So
that's obviously Huntsman, though.
Yeah. So they won. So they won their show match at the launch weekend. Then they won London, and they won an online event at the week 8 Seattle in May. Whether
that would have been with Prestini too. They made a change.
Yeah. So the first event was Scump, Formal, Arceus, Envoy, Gunless, and then they won with Scump, Formal, Arceus, Envoy, Prestini. Yeah. So Gunless out for Prestini. So, but I say that just because they've won 2 events, we'll say, in 2020. I don't think they won any in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, which would have been OpTic Chicago that season.
That was all FaZe in Toronto.
And then 2022, they won one event. They won the first event in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, because I'm pretty sure they won the first major, and then they didn't win again. And then this season they didn't win any, but they got to like 3 grand finals. So like in the CDL era, they've been one of the best teams, one of the top 3 or 4 teams consistently in the standings. And even this season, they at one point were the championship favorites after they went 5-0 back-to-back stages and went to several grand finals in a row. And it hasn't accomplished anything of value for them. And I don't think that's a stretch of any imagination, especially if you talk to an OpTic fan, because they're expecting championships. And despite all of the success that the AW team had, and obviously the IW team that ended up winning the world championship, they have one world championship under their belt, not counting the Dallas Empire or Envies, because I guess together as an organization they have 3 separate titles under 3 separate brands. But OpTic, real OpTic, only has 1 championship throughout their history, or 1 world championship, obviously many majors, major tournaments or whatever. But I mention all of this because it has, like, if this roster doesn't work, what do we say? Like, why couldn't this roster work? And why couldn't some of these past rosters work where they had all the talent, they had the hype, everybody expected them to do well. Maybe they even did well at some point in the season, but they came up short. The variables have kind of been eliminated one by one. You had obviously the failed experiment of Octane and Methods and how horribly it finished in World War II. Then, obviously Crim6 left, Karma left. So those variables are being eliminated. And then Scump left this past season, which he was kind of the last holdover from the old OpTic roster of like the team consistently that would not be able to win the big one, or they'd fall short until 2017, obviously. But now people are going to look at Dashy and Shotzzy the same way, I would imagine. If they don't come up with the championship, we even had Aches this past season saying Shotzi's not a superstar SMG player, blah, blah, blah. He's doing his best Stephen A. Smith impression. But the idea is essentially that if OpTic Texas does not win a world championship, or doesn't win a major, because I think winning a world championship is a really lofty goal, but say they don't win another major this season, and for many years it was a given that OpTic would win one event during a year. But if they go another year without winning an event, what do we say about Dashy? What do we say about Shotzzy? Does the blame just get put on Kenny and Pred? Or does it get put on Karma because he's now the coach? Like, I want to get your opinion on that, because that's something I've always thought about with OpTic.
No, so that was the only other thing I was really thinking about, was that I feel like inevitably, and I don't think this is really a fair comparison, but I'm going to make it just for the sake of having an example. This past year with FaZe, I think nobody would really argue that if like FaZe was going to make a change, it was going to be Slasher. Like the trio just of Celium, Simp, and Abizi seemed untouchable. Even if Slasher was like dropping like a 1.5 or whatever, it seemed like, people would always be like criticizing him or anything like that. He just seemed like the odd man out or the scapegoat, however you want to phrase it. I feel like on this team now, while it could potentially be Pred, I feel like there is a much higher likelihood that it would be Kenny as the odd man out or the scapegoat, however you want to phrase it. And my logic behind that is just because we saw how everything unfolded with Dashy, and I'll get to that in a second. This past season, we saw how all that happened. Shotzzy, is the new Hastro Golden Boy after Hook. And I mean, I guess even the new OpTic Golden Boy now, really just that SMG focal point. And with all the Pred stuff this year about how much they seemingly wanted him, it really feels like Kenny could potentially be the one to take the blame or the criticism, regardless of how he performs at an individual level and stuff like that. Obviously, that's a case that doesn't really matter if they just come out and win every single tournament, but I could definitely see Kenny being like the scapegoat in any situation for fan criticism and whatnot, just because of the other 2 guys who have been on OpTic, and then how much OpTic fans really wanted Pred when all that stuff was going on earlier this year. At the same time, I do think there is a lot of pressure on Dashy. While from the outside looking in, it might seem like after everything transpired between him and Rambo that like now he's kind of like OpTic for life. Just, it seems like Hex isn't going to want to let him go. there's a lot of pressure on that, and I think it was Scump in his retirement video or whatever who said like, I'm stepping down so you can rise up, or whatever the exact quote was. Like, there's just a ton of pressure on Dashy in my eyes for OpTic to succeed if the team was willing to move on. I mean, there was even conversation, I saw some clips on Twitter of Dashy potentially being part of the Pred acquisition earlier this year, and then accuracy would have been dropped from Seattle. Seattle would have had to pick somebody else up, and Pred kind of like casually dropped that in the video, and as if it was like common knowledge, and everyone was a little surprised. But I think that just the past, what happened earlier this year with Dash and everything puts pressure on him to perform. Not only, him performing individually and statistically has never been an issue. It's putting pressure on him to bring championships home. And although I don't think anything, like I said, it seemingly feels like if OpTic was going to make a move with Dashy, it would be like he would just retire or go compete in Valorant or something. I would be very surprised at this point, just based on what happened earlier this season, if Dashy ever played for another CDL team outside of OpTic. But stranger things have happened. I just think there is pressure on Dashy, and at the end of the day, though, with the way everything has happened recently, with Shotzi and Dashy being those OpTic guys from the previous years, Pred being like the unsung hero, or the prodigal son who the Green Wall desperately wanted. I feel like I don't think it's pressure on Kenny, but I think some unfair criticism could be thrown his way this year if this roster fails to succeed right out of the gates.
It's a numbers game, and Kenny will undoubtedly have the lowest KD of this team, because I just don't see any other way about it. Dashy's an AR player, so if his KD is the lowest, like, the team is probably not doing well, in all honesty. And then if Shotzi or Pred have low KDs, like, that would be really surprising, considering they're the fast, slay-heavy SMG players. And then Kenny is kind of the odd man out, or he's probably the most important player, in the sense that if he doesn't do well, they're probably going to lose, and if he does well, they're probably going to win championships. And that's just how I see these players. Somewhat like Drazah, where he's not. I guess it would be more like Kenny last year in LAT, where he didn't really have this fantastic season, but he played very well at champs. They ended up winning that event. But I agree that it's probably Kenny at the top in terms of who gets blamed fastest, or who gets blamed first if things don't go well. But I think it's really 1A Kenny and 1B Dashy, because like you said, Dashy has so many expectations on him because of the Rambo situation, the Scump retirement, getting brought back into the lineup. And I think probably wrongly, but rightly or wrongly, he has this reputation of being a kill whore and not caring about winning. And that's going to follow him, like, from my perspective, until he actually wins a championship, and probably a world championship, because I don't think another major is really going to do anything too much for his standing in that regard, for the people who think that. But I also think that there is an underlying storyline, is how will Shotzi and Pred mesh as players, because for their respective teams, they did a lot of the same things last year. Pred did it on a worse team, but with better numbers. But the idea is that they are both the fastest players on their teams. They average the most engagements for each of their teams. They're both first blood heavy players in Search and Destroy, to the point that Shotzi had a nearly 22% first blood rate for OpTic last year, and Pred had nearly an identical first blood rate for Seattle. The difference, though, in Search was that Pred had a 1.26 KD and Shotzi had a 1.01, and that's because Shotzi almost 50, he was a 50-50 essentially. He either was the first blood or the first death, or he was both. And he was 123 first bloods, 116 first deaths in Search and Destroy, whereas Pred had 110 first bloods, but only 73 first deaths. So like I think Shotzzy could get some of the blame, especially if there are struggles in Search and Destroy, because people are going to look at Shotzzy and be like, he's just throwing his life away. And we've heard that about some other players in the past about like, oh, they play too fast, they play too reckless, essentially. And I'm really interested to see what Pred and Shotzzy can do to figure out how to mesh together and to fit together in a team where they've been doing the same exact job for different teams, and now they have to do it for the same exact team. So that is going to be a pretty interesting storyline as we head into the next season. But I think we can probably transition away from OpTic at this point. I think we both have high expectations for them. I don't know. Their ceiling is world championship. I think we both agree on that. The absolute ceiling is world championship, but I think the floor is probably fourth. You know, like I'd be pretty surprised if they slipped out of the top four. Maybe outside of like the first event or something, if they, have a really bad performance week 1 or week 2, but I think after major 1, it's probably a good, they're probably going to be a top 3 or 4 team at minimum. Let's talk about FaZe next, because FaZe is obviously former world champions. They brought in a former world champion officially now 2 weeks ago from when you're listening to this. Drazah is now a part of Atlanta FaZe. They had a pretty funny intro video for him coming in. Obviously, he has quite a history with FaZe, and if you read our article on .esports.com, I pointed out a lot of the beef, but that wasn't. I didn't even go into everything that had gone on with Drazah and FaZe, specifically Simp and Abizi. Well, actually, all of them, because Slasher had something to say to Drazah, obviously not a part of FaZe anymore. But Celium and Simp and Abizi were all a part of the beef with Drazah between LAT and Atlanta. So, we talked about it last week, or 2 weeks ago, rather. But what is your reaction now that it is finalized and Drazah is officially the new member of Atlanta FaZe?
Yeah, I think I'm really excited to see how this team works out. I think, again, the flexibility of Drazah is something that should come into play here. And there was a lot of conversations about keeping Celium on the flex and getting another main AR, which would have been the formula the last couple of years, potentially moving Simp to a flex and getting another sub. But in the end, they decide to move Celium to main AR and get a flex. So I think Celium's play style, and a lot of people have criticized how slow he is at times, especially nade shot. During like watch parties and stuff, he was pretty critical of like his lack of interactions and stuff like that. So that play style could be well suited to just a solid AR, though Celium is definitely capable of using an SMG and has shown it multiple times. I just think this is an interesting roster, and seemingly, as you mentioned with the tweets and stuff, it seems like the guys are going to let the past be the past, and they are gonna put that stuff behind them and move on to form a strong bond, or however you want to phrase it. But that is definitely something in the back of my mind as this team starts to play together and stuff, is how the chemistry is going to be, and if they really are just going to be able to put all the trash talk and stuff behind them and move on to be as deadly of a squad as a lot of people think they will be.
I am concerned a little bit because Drazah, in his explanation of why he picked Atlanta over OpTic, said essentially, or he really said it straight up, Atlanta always places top 3. How could you not join a team that is always in contention to win at the end of a tournament? And I'm not concerned about that thinking per se, but it's that it's all about winning. And if they don't win, they're like, I can't overlook the personal stuff that was said. Like, this wasn't all just in-game trash talk. Like, there were like girlfriends and just like really serious things being talked about or joked about, if you want to just say it was jokes. But at the same time, like personally, I'd have a hard time just like forgiving it maybe to win championships, sure. But if you're not winning championships, say Atlanta FaZe has the same struggles that they had in 2022, where they were Silver Surfers, they couldn't get over the hump, they could not win a championship, or this year when they won an event but then had trouble repeating that same accomplishment. If that happens in 2023 with Drazah as part of the Atlanta FaZe roster, what happens at that point? Does the little barbs, does the drama underneath that we were obviously talking about as this roster change was being reported on, does that any of it bubble up once they don't have success? I think that's really my concern at the moment, because I don't think it's a skill issue. But I think something probably had to change with FaZe, because they dropped RCDs and went with Slasher. It worked better, I guess, because they won an event, but they also did worse at champs. Like, they didn't get to the grand finals. So whether you want to say it was better or worse, I think it's about even. But now Slasher's out, Drazah's in. The roles will probably change, because Slasher was an AR player. Drazah is capable of doing both, but I don't know if he'll be main AR like we saw with Slasher. So like the roles are going to change here, and then the drama there is really interesting. Do you agree with me though that would you be concerned as an Atlanta FaZe fan that this roster change is happening? And will it do like you don't really know that it's resolved, or more just so kind of pushed aside and been like, we're just going to work together?
No, yeah, I mean that's definitely something that's got to be in the back of your mind. But based on everything we've seen so far, at least, it doesn't seem like it's going to immediately be an issue. But it definitely is something. Who knows? First week of scrims or something's not going right. They get in an argument, and boom, who knows what happens? So, we'll have to see it. I guess it'll also be a true testament to how much that past trash talk really was just trash talk, and how much was actually like personal attacks on because I think there's a difference between going at somebody like that and just talking trash to talk trash, like I talked to Jim. So there's.
But you hate Jim.
I think it is a concern. I don't think it's. Oh, it's tough to say. It could be a major concern, but it's really just going to be, at the end of the day, it's going to be how it all works out. But I don't think, Crowder and all those guys behind the scenes would have signed off on this move without talking. I'm pretty sure they said. I think I might have saw a video of Crowder saying like they had a talk with everybody before they confirmed the move and stuff like that. So, they have a really good and smart and talented coaching staff at Atlanta. So, I trust those guys, and I definitely think this team has a ton of talent. So, it will be interesting to see how it plays out, and that's definitely a storyline we're gonna have to keep an eye on. Is the chemistry? I don't think the gun skill is ever going to be questioned with this FaZe roster. It's going to be the chemistry, and I don't even want to say out of game stuff. Just I guess reactions to what happens in game, and maybe outside of the map stuff is the best way to phrase it.
Yeah, because I look at New York, and Hydra is excellent, and so many of those players on the Subliners roster are good players, but that roster was not seen as like, oh man, like they're loaded. They have so many stars on this roster, and they ended up winning a championship. Obviously, they're changing their roster to bring in someone who is, supposedly a better player than the one they had, and we'll see how that works out for them. But my issue is that so much of this is interpersonal relationships and how you mesh with teammates. And there are times when you can overcome that, and your relationship doesn't need to be perfect. And OpTic Gaming, the 2017 world champions, are perfect examples of that, on the brink of turning on each other and not playing with each other and breaking up their roster. And I'm sure that there were different moments throughout that entire, whatever it was, like 2-3 years they were together, that they hated each other. And we saw a little bit of that when they were streaming scrims. I think it was in Black Ops 3, just the little fights and the little arguments. But sometimes you can overcome that, but I think a lot of times you don't overcome that. It's more about how you get on with your teammates, and that's a concern of mine, at least for Atlanta FaZe.
Obviously, it's a different situation, but just you bringing up Hydra, brings up the stuff from last offseason, which, again, very different situation with the drama between the New York camp and Crim and all that stuff. But obviously there were some questions around New York heading into this past year, and especially, again, it wasn't really questions about Hydra's gun skill or anything like that. It was a question of like meshing with teammates, and he clashed with the previous squad apparently and all this stuff. So how's that going to work out? And worked out pretty well for all those parties involved. For New York, Hydra wins MVP, 3 championships, wins champs. So who knows? Maybe this is the 2024 Atlanta FaZe squad is the storyline in terms of getting over toxicity or whatever this time around. But like I said, not exactly a 1-for-1 example there. But you mentioning his name did make me think of that.
New York is a good example, though, that the coaching staff or the front office or whatever, they understood their players well enough to create a roster that could work even with all that drama still fresh in their minds. Obviously, Hydra and Crim6 and Hydra and Paul X did not get along. Very evident after the season. We didn't know it at the time, but after the season that became very evident. Apparently, the issues were not with Hydra and Kismet, because Kismet stayed on with the roster and they ended up forging a really strong partnership throughout the season, to the point that Hydra was season MVP and Kismet was champs MVP, and deservedly so on both accounts. And New York brought in a friend of Hydra's in Skies. He was his Val pal or whatever people were saying about him when he was getting signed last offseason. But they picked a guy who was not only talented, but they knew had a good relationship with the player that had bad relationships with some of the other guys. And sometimes that works out in traditional sports where you try to placate a specific player. I think basketball sometimes, you try to align your existing superstar with players that they already like. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And New York, they found a good balance, and they were able to create a roster that not only won champs, but they won 2 other events before that, and in our setup very well to be a championship contender again in 2023 or 2024. It's whatever the season starts. But I think the point remains that New York did a really good job. We'll see if Atlanta picked the right guy or they went the right direction with Drazah. That's again, OpTic and FaZe being of a lot of interest in this coming season about just how their rosters will play out, because same thing with last year coming into the season. OpTic was making some changes, and obviously they experienced a lot of changes early on in the season, and Atlanta made their first change in several years. So it's really interesting to watch out for, and they both have a real chance at winning a world championship next year. Next up, Boston, a team that I don't think either one of us are expecting to be world championship contenders, but they've constructed a pretty formidable roster in Boston. They did not stand pat. They were not satisfied, I guess, with how the season ended or how the season went at all for themselves. So they have now created a roster with a mix of veteran championship level talent or championship experience talent, with some of the youngest and hopefully brightest players in the CDL. Capsidal, who played his rookie season with the Breach last year and spent this past season with the Florida Mutineers, he has returned to the Breach and will be joining Slasher, Snoopy, and Priesta in a pretty interesting roster. What do you make of the Breach's new CDL lineup?
Yeah, I think just on paper, there's still a bunch of teams that we don't even have rosters for, or even reported rosters for, but it's pretty seemingly based on what we know so far. It seems like that upper echelon in no particular order is OpTic, FaZe, Toronto, New York. And then I would put Boston right after that and probably the middle of the pack, top six range. I think a lot of interesting storylines for this team and for almost all the players. Snoopy making his debut, getting a full chance to start a year as a CDL. What is he going to be capable of? Priesta, obviously on his revenge tour, getting dropped, or however you want to phrase that, signing with a new team after winning a world championship. Slasher getting dropped from FaZe, and that situation there, and Capsidal even is the really interesting one to me, just because he does have that previous experience with Boston, and he was benched at the end of the Vanguard season by Boston. I think it was either before the last major or before champs, because I don't think he played. Okay, so it was the end of the season, which means he just didn't get to play at champs, and then obviously he didn't play at champs this year because Florida didn't make it. But Capsule showed a lot of potential in his first year. I know I don't remember the number, and I don't remember if he ended the season with a record, but I just remember one of my favorite things to track in the Vanguard season was the Bocage hardpoint kills record for just the individual map, and Capsidal was up there at one point. I think it was like 48 or something like that, or I'm just completely throwing that number
Sounds
out of nowhere. But yeah, I don't know if he ended the season with the most kills on the map or whatnot, but I just know he was a little streaky, which I guess would be to be expected of a rookie player, but he definitely showed a lot of potential and moments of potential. So I'm excited to see what he's able to do in his return to Boston here. I think it would be interesting to hear. I think Boston actually, the guys. Zed and Den's, the coach and GM of Boston, started doing like a video series. So I would be interested to hear from him or from them the thought process in bringing back a guy that they, don't want to. I guess it is fair to say they kind of put him on the map because they gave him his first chance in the CDL. And then they bench him. He goes away after that for a full year, and then they bring him back. Kind of, like a whirlwind of, interactions there. So I would be interested to hear from the management side of Boston their thought process on what happened in terms of benching him and moving on from him and then deciding to bring him back, what has kind of changed in that period. And I'd also be interested to hear from Capsidal in terms of what he's thinking in terms, like it's kind of got to be in the back of your head, like they benched me once when I don't want to say it was for performance or anything like that, but let's just say for this, sake of the example, back of his head, Capsule could be like, they benched me once before. Is it going to happen again? Like that could be either a worry or it could be a motivational factor. You could be like, I don't want to get benched by this team again. I'm going to go out there and do my thing, and I'm going to make it impossible for them to bench me. So I think there's a lot of interesting narratives and storylines around all the players on this team. I think with Snoopy and Capsule, there's just a lot of raw potential there, and it's going to be up to Slasher to get the most out of them. And I think he is definitely the type of player who should be up for that challenge in terms of trying to teach those guys his style and getting the most out of them. So I'm interested to see how that works. And yeah, I think, like I said earlier, just on paper, right off the bat, we don't know all the rosters, but I could definitely see this being a middle of the pack team. And who knows if the narratives play out right, especially Priesta comes out having a 1.3 to kick off his revenge tour. Who knows if they end up taking an event.
Yeah, it's a really interesting roster. I would have that worry that you mentioned with Capsidal of what if they bench me again, or will they bench me again? I would certainly have that concern with Boston because Boston did it with Capsidal in 2022, where they benched him before the final major, the final stage. I think it might have been. But either way, very late in the season, as the season was winding down, and they benched him and brought in Vivid. And this past season, they had I think only Awakening was he was the only player from the beginning of the season to be on the starting roster at the end of the season because they brought in Kremp. They brought back Vivid. He had gotten benched and then he got promoted again, and then he got benched again right before champs for Snoopy. Nero got benched at one point for Vivid. So like a lot of benching going on around the Boston camp. Not as much in 2022, but definitely a lot this past season. And there's always the chance that this team will be middle of the pack, and maybe that's not good enough for the breach. And that's got to be something in their mind, at least as players, about like what if sixth place isn't good enough for Boston, because I don't think sixth place is by any stretch of the imagination an unrealistic place for Boston to be, because that's pretty much been where they've been the last 2 seasons that they've been in the CDL. They've been a middle of the pack team. I think at one point they were probably the 4th best team like early on, or like maybe halfway through their first season in the CDL, but they had a really bad finish to the season, if I remember correctly. And this past year, they definitely did not have a good finish to the season, despite winning a match at champs. So like I don't think like this roster is overwhelming. I think where you put them about 5th, and that's all just depending on what these other teams are able to create as well, because they're one of the maybe 6 or 7 teams that we know of that actually have rosters. Some of these have been reports. Obviously, something like Atlanta or OpTic or Toronto, those teams have been confirmed, and those teams are really, really good, and certainly, at least on paper, a step above Boston at the moment. But
I mean,
who knows?
Technically, we have.
Oh, what are you saying?
I was gonna just say, I mean, all indications seem like Toronto is just adding Envoy, but we haven't even technically gotten confirmation of Kleenex and Insight returning, just because there was speculation around that earlier in the offseason. So if you think about it, Boston, OpTic, and Atlanta are really the 3 confirmed teams that we know for sure. Toronto is probably like a 90%, maybe even higher than 90%, but I wouldn't go higher than 99 just because we haven't gotten that official confirmation. And even New York, like we know Priesta isn't there, but we don't have the confirmation that Sib is joining the team. So outside of those 5 teams, we have reports on teams like Minnesota, LAT. There was the report on the Miami/Florida team, but now that might not happen. So, and then there's Vegas, who knows, London, who knows, Seattle, don't really know. So we really only have like 3 confirmed teams, then 2 teams that are like almost guaranteed, and then the rest is just question marks or reports.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of the Boston thing, is like they have obviously championship experience with Slasher and now Priesta. And Snoopy, we saw him for 3 matches, maybe 4 matches this season. So we didn't get to see a lot of him. And now we have Capsidal, who is a good player, but I don't know if he really changes the trajectory of any team. And that to me is like they're essentially in the same position. I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, because I don't think this is like a bottom 4 team. I think there will be teams that construct rosters that are far worse than this. But I see this as not necessarily a huge step up for Boston, and certainly not a step down. Like I think Slasher is an improvement over any player that Boston had last year, but he can't make or break a roster at this point. Like I don't think any player can, to be honest. I don't think you can add 1 player to an average roster and then that team is just a championship contender. I think Boston is right around where they were the last 2 seasons, and that is a champs qualifier and maybe more depending on the matchup, but likely around 6th or 7th in the league. Maybe I'll be wrong, and they have all the time and all of the ability to prove me wrong this coming season, but I think the top 4 is so strong, and there's always a breakout player, a breakout team that we don't expect coming into the year, and they they prove people wrong. I look at someone like Pred or Sib in Seattle last year, where I think there was expectations for them, but for them to be one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the league, that's a gigantic improvement, and I think they exceeded a lot of expectations, and there will probably be another one of those teams. Maybe Boston is that team, who knows, but at the moment, I just am not sold on Boston being anything above where you said is like 5th. I think 5th is about as high as I could put them without actually having seen them play. So on paper, I would say 5th is probably the way to go. Another team I think we should talk about is the Minnesota RØKKR. Obviously, this is not confirmed, but we do have some reports coming out. So Jacob Hale of Dexerto reported on July 25th that the Minnesota RØKKR are targeting a roster of Accuracy, Awakening, Vivid, and Lens for the 2023-24 CDL season. Jacob Hale said contracts are not yet signed, but this is the 4 they want, and it's looking positive. So I want to get your thoughts on this roster: Awakening, Vivid, Lens, and Accuracy on the Minnesota RØKKR.
Yeah, obviously, I don't know anything about Lens. I think he's a young European player. You look at his COD game Wikipedia page, says he's 18 and from France, so it seems like Minnesota is potentially trying to get their own little Hydra. Yep. The interesting thing, well, 2 things outside of Lens, obviously that's exciting if he's a young prospect who has a lot of potential. But the other side of this roster, the 2 parts of it that are kind of interesting to me is that Awakening and Vivid are trying to stick together. We saw, in Vanguard, they tried to play together in Florida, didn't really get a ton of great results. And then we just saw them together on Boston as well, didn't really get a ton of great results. So it's interesting to see them try again if this team potentially it comes to fruition. And then the other side of that is Accuracy returning to Minnesota. Historically and famously had that wild clutch play against OpTic, the 1v3 where everybody lined up on Moscow in the corner of the bomb, and the round 11. So he has that history on Minnesota. I would just be interested to see how him and Awakening work together. I know Awakening has a lot of talent and slaying ability, and I think he does better if he's just going around trying to get kills. So I don't think it would conflict too much with Accuracy being more of a slower AR player, but I would be interested to see how that AR duo shapes up.
Yeah, I don't think this roster really works all that well. The same concerns, 2 ARs. It has not usually worked well in COD. I think the only time it's really worked is when we were 5-man rosters, where you could have 2 ARs as long as one was not, they weren't both statue ARs. But I think it's just probably a meta thing. Like if MW3 is AR heavy, then it could work. But I think we've seen from multiple games at this point that it's really unlikely that that's going to be the meta. Typically it is a 3 SMG meta, or we've really only had like 1 3-gun meta in a while, and that was Black Ops 4. So I don't see that happening, and again, that was a 5-person game. So I just don't see it working out. I again, like you said, don't know anything about Lens. But he was on that, I don't even know how you say it, but the team Wababobs or whatever it is, and in Challengers with Brezzy, Cobra, and Abuza. And I know Abuza has been kind of hyped up as another one of these like really talented young players from Europe. He's Belgian, and he's actually 23, so I guess he's not as young as some of these other guys. But at the same point, or with the same point, it's a good step that they're looking elsewhere. They're not just using every CDL player that's been on another team. Obviously 3/4 of the team has been on multiple CDL teams, but bringing in Lens seems like the right idea. to just see what else is out there. I think this roster currently constructed is, if it is the actual roster that ends up being the team that starts the season for Minnesota, I would imagine that they will make a roster change at some point in this season. They usually make a roster change. Minnesota does, and again, like Boston, they've kind of been middle of the road, other than the first few months on LAN in the first season of the CDL, which was kind of the highest point, and obviously Minnesota ended up winning that final major of, what was that, 2021, when they beat Toronto. So that was definitely their highest point, but other than that, they have been pretty middle of the road, and I see that continuing with this roster. But good first step to bring in a very exciting European Challengers player.
Yeah, and just a quick side note. I'm gonna check Tash's Twitter, but yeah, it was 2 years ago today that Minnesota pulled off the Minnesota Miracle, with the 0-4 reverse sweep in the grand finals of Cold War against Toronto. So, pretty convenient that we brought that up, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty much the thing that people bring up with Minnesota, other than the Boston, like what was that, Sound EQ drama at one of the lands. But that's pretty much like Minnesota. Obviously, they missed champs last year, if I'm not mistaken, and they barely got in this year. Yeah, like it's been Minnesota sports for them as well. They've been either a playoff team that has not performed well, or they've kind of collapsed at some points. To be honest, like we didn't even really see them as like a huge championship threat when they won the final major heading into champs in 2021, because FaZe was just so far ahead of everyone that we figured that they would end up winning the championship, and that ended up being true. So I think we're gonna have to look at Minnesota and see if they can break out of that mold of being kind of a middle of the road team like Boston has been, and Minnesota has been the last few years. Another thing that we can talk about, Rambo. I think we mentioned this 2 weeks ago, but Rambo has officially signed, according to Jacob Hale of Dexerto. Rambo has officially signed with the Seattle Surge to be the head coach for the Surge for the upcoming CDL season. And Hale said work's still being done with Rambo to build the new Surge squad. So no indication, other than some report that I cannot pull up because I don't remember who said it, but it was a report that he was going to put together a French-speaking, like a French-Canadian roster.
Yep.
If that turns out to be the case, cool. I have no idea. But I think there are a lot of teams that are looking at these younger players because they see that they are probably cheaper players than some of the existing CDL players that have maybe are accustomed to some of the bigger salaries. So I'll be interested to see what Rambo's able to do in terms of roster construction, because obviously he was a part of the Dallas Empire, and an integral part of their organization, and was a part of the OpTic Texas organization as well until this year, with all the Dashy stuff. So he's going to have, it seems like, free reign to kind of do what he pleases with the roster. And I think that's going to be pretty intriguing, at least from my end, to see where he ends up. Do you have any guesses, or what do you think Rambo, because he's always been a really strategic, very smart player, and obviously as part of the Empire, he has a world championship as a coach / GM or whatever. So any guesses on what he might end up doing with Seattle?
No, it's really tough right now with so much out there, and I think that was like we definitely talked about this in a little bit, but I don't think Jacob Hale reported on it. I think somebody reported on it first, and now Jacob Hale is reporting on it, so it seems more likely to happen now. But regardless, I know the last time we did talk about this, I mentioned that I just think Rambo is one of the smartest minds in Call of Duty. So if you're giving him the reins to form a squad and try and get a championship contender out of what's available. I definitely trust him, and it's definitely going to be interesting. Whatever squad he puts together faces off against OpTic and Dashy, there might be some extra motivation there and some other storylines. So that'll be interesting. But yeah. You gotta imagine if there was that initial report on like the French-speaking team or whatever like that Linz, obviously I don't know much of the European scene, but if Linz is another one of those young French players, you would imagine that he was potentially in like being targeted for that squad. So if he's reportedly going to Minnesota now, plans might have changed there. Don't really know much right now, so will be interesting to see what happens there. But if Rambo is officially confirmed by Seattle, I am definitely going to be excited to see what squad he puts together, and whenever that's announced, I will be looking forward to talking about it.
Another team that Jacob Hale is reporting on in terms of roster news, the Los Angeles Thieves. We talked about them on the last show, or maybe that was 2 shows ago, about how they had lost $2 million on their team in 2022 when they won a world championship, and obviously fell short of that goal this year, and parted ways with all of their players, going to OpTic, Atlanta, Octane retiring, and obviously Envoy going to Toronto as well. So everybody's out for LAT as far as the roster. It seems like J-Cap and Shane will be back with the coaching staff, but the actual roster is up in the air. But according to Jacob Hale, multiple sources have confirmed to him that LAT are targeting a roster of Ghosty, Cammy, Afro, and Joe Deceives for the 2023-24 CDL seasons. Contracts not yet signed, but this is the direction they're heading, according to Jacob Hale. That roster is really interesting because that is a very random assortment of players, at least on the surface, but they are also I can't say that Joe Deceives is like one of those players, but Afro was very hyped up heading into last year at least. Cammy was an MVP candidate 2 seasons ago, and Ghosty was at the center of the OpTic Texas turnaround this past year when he came in mid-season and made his CDL debut, went to 3 straight grand finals, I think, in majors, and then obviously a really bad finish to the season. But either way, it's still it's an odd group of players. What do you make of this? Because obviously you were very excited to see Joe Deceives heading into his CDL debut, because I think he was the player that he was like discovered and ranked player, something along those lines. So what do you make of LAT's reported potential roster?
Yeah, I think the interesting, well, I think it is interesting on all accounts for the individual players, but I really do think the Ghosty signing is like the exclamation point to me. If it was confirmed, it would kind of, from a narrative standpoint, would almost echo Envoy situation, right? Envoy being the prince and all that stuff with OpTic, goes to LAT, wins the world championship and sees success. And now I don't think Ghosty was ever heralded as the prince or anything like that, but going from OpTic to Nadeshot's organization is interesting. And I even had mentioned it before this report came out that I could see Ghosty being a good fit on an LAT team if they were looking to, build a cheap squad around young players. So I am definitely excited to see how he's able to perform if, this team does come to fruition. Like you said, Cammy has shown a lot of superstar potential, but at times has been shaky and inconsistent. Same with Afro, really. He was never necessarily an MVP candidate like Cammy was in Cold War, but he definitely had some superstar moments on, some bad London teams. And then last year, obviously, a lot of expectations. He was performing well at times when Minnesota did well in Boston, but then he gets benched. So it'd be a question of what kind of Afro LAT is getting. And then Joe Deceives, he's that another young rookie who has potential but was on a bad team this past year, and outside of their honeymoon phase when they first formed, LAG really didn't see a ton of success. So a lot of question marks with this potential team, but I could see it having some potential to be another middle of the pack squad, which, as we talked about previously when the reports came out of LAT confirming how much money they lost or whatever it was with their previous teams and potentially looking to, go for a lower salary team this next year. That we mentioned that might not be something LAT fans are really, looking forward to by any stretch of the imagination. Similar to the Green Wall, LAT fans, and especially after the World Championship 2 years ago, they kind of expect success. So will be interesting to see how they handle that if they sign a team that doesn't see immediate success. But even in these past couple of years, LAT saw their success at the end of the year. Just even this past year, they struggled at times early in the season. They went 0-5, I think, in the Major 2 qualifiers. No,
It was later.
I don't think it was.
Wasn't it after
they went 0-5 after they won, yeah, but I was saying they struggled at Major 2, and then they went on that loser bracket run to get to the finals at the Boston Major.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I was thinking. And then obviously they win the Major, and then they struggle after that, which was what Toronto did, yada, yada. But, I was saying that they struggled early in the season this past year, won a Major towards the end of the year, and then obviously in Vanguard, they struggled in the beginning of the year, had their role change, and win back-to-back, including champs. So if anything, LAT has been a late season team these past couple of years. But it'll just be interesting to see if this is the roster they end up going with, how it all meshes together.
I don't know what to make of it because Cammy and Afro are part of that Minnesota roster that I had really high hopes for. Admittedly, I did not have high hopes for the LAG roster, if I'm not mistaken, that Joe DeCeves was on. And I didn't know anything about Ghosty when he got to OpTic. And he obviously, other than the end result, and of course people will look at the end result, but I think that's hardly, he's hardly to blame, the only one to blame, for OpTic's failures at the end of the year. And it would be shocking if he didn't end up on a good team, because that's about as good of a rookie season outside of Scrappy or Simp or something. That's a really impressive rookie year to come in on the most popular team, the team that faces the most criticism and also gets the most celebration when they do well. To come into that right off the heels of Scump retiring, Dashy and Rambo getting into it, and Rambo eventually leaving, to come into that and then lead your team or help your team, either way you want to put it, get to 3 grand finals and be one of the best teams heading into the last stage or the last major really of the season, and then for it to all fall apart. I think Ghosty definitely deserves a lot of credit for getting them to that point. Obviously not the only one, everybody deserves credit, but especially him coming in mid-season. But the roster as a whole, I don't know what to make of it. I was not expecting it in the slightest that LAT was going in this direction, or that they might be going in this direction. I thought for sure that based on how LAT had been speaking about it, and if you go back to the Nate Shot Knows podcast, where he has some of the LAT business people on, and they're talking about the LAT project and what the future looks like, it sounded like a certainty that they would be going for a challengers roster of young guys really hungry. And I don't want to say that these guys aren't hungry or young or anything, but Afro's been around, Cammy's been around, Ghosty, obviously, and Joe DeCeves were, I think Joe DeCeves made his rookie debut this past season as well. So, it just seems odd that they're all existing CDL players and that there aren't any challengers players that seem to be making it their way into the roster. So I found that to be surprising, but it'll be an interesting roster if this does come through and ends up being finalized. I don't know where to put them because I overhyped Minnesota last year, and Afro and Cameo were a part of that. And it's good to see at least that there seems to be no ill will between those guys, or that they seem to like each other from their Minnesota experience. But I have no idea where to put this roster. I'd probably, at the moment, they'd have to be middle of the pack just because we don't know what the LA or what the Las Vegas Legion are going to do, or LAG. We don't really know exactly how that's going to shape up Seattle, etc.
We don't even know if LAG is going to exist. We don't
Yeah.
even know if it's Florida or Miami Heretics. We don't know if we got the Vamos. We don't know.
We don't know what London's doing because
Right.
they could
They
be
might go
the
to
North
Charlotte.
Carolina
Yeah.
Ravens. So, we don't know anything really. That's more of a general theme of our lives, but especially in terms of ROSTERMania, like half the league is still completely unknown, and there doesn't seem to be any inkling about, oh, this team is heading in this direction or this team is targeting this player. Like, I would assume Clayster will be on a roster at some point in the next CDL season, but I don't think I've heard anything outside of like potential Boston overtures that
Yeah.
obviously did not come to fruition.
I haven't really heard anything about Attach.
Yeah.
We're talking about Cammy and Afro too. Bance, haven't heard much about him. So yeah, there's a lot of guys.
Yeah, Mac doesn't seem to be attached to any of those teams. I mean, there are a lot of challengers players that obviously we don't discuss a lot on this podcast other than maybe mentioning them here or there. But even a player like Nero, who was on Boston the last 2 years, hasn't been really mentioned at all. Kremp, who made his CDL debut, and like I think it was a little surprising that they didn't keep him on as part of like the academy team or a substitute Boston. And the whole Florida Miami thing, who knows what's going on with that, because it seemed like a certainty that they were going to go with the Spanish speaking roster. And if that doesn't happen and they don't go with Spanish speaking roster, those guys are obviously missing out on an opportunity of a lifetime to have their own CDL team where they don't have to compromise like their language or their culture or anything, which would obviously be ideal for them. But if they don't get that roster spot, like who is going to be on that roster? Who's going to be a part of the Florida Mutineers? Because we've already seen Capsidal leave, and there's no idea of like who's going to be on that Mutineers roster. Would even Vickle be a part of that team if he's not a part of the Spanish speaking roster that was lined up? There's just so many question marks, and I guess that's what makes ROSTERMania fun, is that teams will be completely remade and remodeled in an off season. Like they'll be completely different teams. Seattle, the change from the 2021 roster to the 2022 roster, like that was a huge overhaul of what the Seattle Surge were about, and it ended up being very successful for them. We'll see if that is the case for some of these other teams that are trying to get out of the bottom four or get in that middle pack or get above there to being a championship contender. I don't think we had anything else, did we, about ROSTERMania? So we covered it: OpTic, FaZe, Boston, Minnesota, Seattle, and LAT. So that's half the league, but the other half, like I said, is pretty unknown, and we'll make sure to keep you guys updated on when and what happens with those teams as they become reported on or announce anything. I would like a surprise announcement at least once this offseason. It would be nice just to see if a team could keep stuff from leaking, because that seems to be the common case essentially since Crone came on the scene, and obviously Crone not reporting as much now, but it seems to have opened up a door where there aren't very many surprises, but should be really interesting offseason because we still got half the league to talk about. Make sure to subscribe, like, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube as well. Make sure to subscribe on the YouTube and like the video when this goes up. 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts as well. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast stores at Ego Chall Podcast. Not sure when the next show will be. Probably next week or 2 weeks. We're kind of fallen into a rhythm of every other week, depending on the news. I will be out of town next Wednesday and Thursday, but if we did a podcast earlier in the week, that wouldn't matter at all. And I think that's it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep, thank you guys as always for all the support. Like Preston said, we're kind of playing it by ear and going with the flow of the off season. So not much is going on. We don't have much to talk about, but if some news does drop, you can expect to hear from us relatively soon. So until next time, remember to send the chow.